This is the information package for improving Indigenous Australian health for physiotherapists at the Stay Well Health and Rehabilitation Clinic. First of all, I wish to acknowledge the Dharawal people, the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. Outline of topics to be discussed. The information package has been designed to inform and educate the physiotherapist and administrative staff of Stay Well Health and Rehabilitation Clinic, located within the Dharawal Nation. The intention of the information package is to provide staff with an understanding of how history and the invention of racial science has influenced healthcare provided to the Indigenous Australians. It will also illustrate how the social determinants of health severely impact the health and well-being of Indigenous Australians. The information presented will also highlight the importance of considering Indigenous Australians' own perspective on health and well-being to help staff create appropriate treatment plans. Brief history of Indigenous Australians. Evidence suggests that Indigenous Australians have inhabited Australia for at least 65,000 years. During this time, they've built a strong relationship with land, flora, fauna, and each other. And when British settlement occurred and claimed the land under the doctrine of terra nullius, meaning land belonging to no one, this resulted in murder, foreign diseases including smallpox, influenza, venereal diseases, provided different foods, sugar and flour, beverages including tea, which caused iron deficiencies, and foreign laws being introduced. These all contributed to a reduction in health and well-being. According to the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, Indigenous Australian males in 2015 to 17 had a reduced life expectancy of 8.6 years less than their non-Indigenous Australian counterparts. This was similarly found within Indigenous Australian females in the same time period that had a reduced life expectancy of 7.8 years less than their non-Indigenous Australian counterparts. Racial science and colonial domination. British rulers saw Indigenous Australians as being inferior through a racial lens. Therefore, they were not treated as equal despite being the original custodians of the land. A meaning for definition for colonialism is the power that is exercised through occupation and subsequent majority settlement that has helped shape the institutions, including the health system of today. Indigenous Australian rights and values have been discounted due to Western culture ideology. The Great Chain of Being illustrates a hierarchical structure that suggests that British citizens were superior to Indigenous Australians. A definition of race is that the primary factor of human traits and capacities enabling producing inherent superiority over another race that help determine cultural and individual achievement. A further definition of race is that it can be conceptualised as an assumption whereby there is a belief of a biological and genetic difference between groups of people. Definition of racism is that each group of humans had a specific and clear cultural characteristic and abilities that differ from another group of people. Laws and regulations that affected, verified racism that stood out is the 1909 Aborigines Protection Act, New South Wales, that vested power in the board to oversee and control reserves to ensure that non-Indigenous Australians did not associate with Indigenous Australians or enter reserves. Stolen generations were the forced separation of Indigenous Australian children from their parents or carers. They were forced to live in a white Australia as this was seen as being a superior culture, whilst forcing them to live in boarding schools or with white Christian families. Important historical events included Indigenous Australians given the right to vote in 1962. In 1992, the Australian High Court rejected the notion of terra nullius in the Mabo versus Queensland matter and legally confirmed their traditional native title rights. Then there was a government policy by the then Prime Minister Kevin Rudd in 2008 for the actions relating to stolen generations. It was also noted that the Western culture had been forced onto Indigenous Australians. It wasn't something that they had a choice, it has been forced onto them. So stadial theory and phrenology. So Stadial theorists argued in the 18th and 19th centuries that human ecology traits were more advanced in Western societies due to the perceived ownership of private property, therefore making British and white citizens superior to their Indigenous Australian counterparts. Phrenology and chronology were racial sciences that were adopted by the British in the 19th century, and these were used skull measurements to ascertain intelligence and were racial stereotyping. Social Darwinism. Indigenous Australian was seen by proponents of social Darwinism as being primitive and inferior to non-Indigenous Australians, and it was thought that eventually Indigenous Australians would die off. Social Darwinism also suggested human races had evolved through Darwinian processes of natural selection through survival of the fittest, along with cultural differences having arisen out of genetic differences. Social Darwinism also considered that various races of the world are at different stages on a vertical evolutionary scale, with dark-skinned races being closer to primates at the lower end and white European race closer to the human physical and cultural perfection at the top. Social Darwinism was seen as a justification by the British establishment and successive Australian governments for isolating Indigenous Australians and treating them poorly. Deficit discourse is a way of thinking that alleges that Indigenous Australians have caused their own problems. This hampers in identifying strengths, capabilities and Indigenous Australian rights which would enhance their overall health and life by allowing Indigenous Australians a greater say in how to improve their health through greater collaboration and understanding of their lifestyle. A disregard of Indigenous Australian culture is detrimental to Indigenous Australians' health, and it fails to look at the fact that Indigenous Australians were mostly healthy for thousands of years prior to white settlement. Social determinants of health have a major influence on lifespan and how we live and our quality of life. The World Health Organization describes social determinants of health as the circumstances in which people grow, live, work and age, and the systems put in place to deal with illnesses. The conditions in which people live and die are in turn shaped by political, social and economic forces. Social determinants of health include socio-economic factors that include meaningful employment and education. It also encompasses social services, housing, transport and quality healthcare. Here's a brief look at of many of the factors within social determinants of health. And so two of these are education and employment. And education is a polarising topic. Our Western education system focuses on formal teaching methodology, which has very little relevance to many Indigenous Australians. Indigenous teaching methodology should be adopted to stem the division and boredom, which is often associated with learning in a traditional school environment. It also helps to provide gratifying employment and a gaining earner potential. Housing is important. It provides safety, provides clean running water, sanitation and shelter from the elements. It's also important to have Indigenous Australians provide input into the design of the house. And this can help reduce overcrowding, which can cause the spread of infectious disease. Racism and discrimination also has a major factor as a social determinant. It has serious impact on self-esteem, health and well-being. There's prejudice among health professionals, resulting in certain beliefs and judgments. And it clouds treatment options and takes the patient's point of view out of any treatment plan that may be adopted by the health professional. Social services can include good transport, good infrastructure, good community support services, health, welfare and legal support. Culture as wealth. Wealth is often spoken about Indigenous Australian communities where family and strong cultural identities are present. This bodes well for Indigenous Australians' health and mental well-being, with cultural maintenance and vitality being important for resilience. Indigenous Australian health encompasses not only the individual but includes the whole community. Okay, so cultural safety framework within Indigenous perspectives on health. This includes respecting dialogue, minimising power between the patient and the practitioner, being respectful, and removing disempowerment. Cultural competency includes understanding the patient, being empathetic, and understanding of how colonisation affects the health of Indigenous Australians. Cultural respect requires the practitioner to remove barriers for successful treatment. It also allows for greater trust between the patient and the practitioner. There becomes a shared respect. It's important to improve communication and getting to know the patient's history. Deficit discourse again alienates Indigenous Australians. It fuels already indentured historical racial narratives. It promotes negativity and generalises important health issues. It also highlights the historical racial undertones that help to portray Indigenous Australians as the problem in society that needs to be solved. So what is health? The World Health Organisation's definition of health is a state of complete physical, mental and social well-being and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. Another perspective on health may encompass that having family nearby, breathing fresh air and feeling like they belong is health. What model should we use? Should we use the biomedical, social, or the more accepted now biopsychosocial model, or another unique health model? All staff need to have a good understanding of the history of colonialism and racial discrimination that has helped shape our current healthcare system. So how should a physiotherapist communicate with Indigenous Australians individually? Working individually with Indigenous Australians, it is important to communicate effectively and respectfully. This includes building rapport, maintaining personal space, and seeking permission before touching. And also understand avoidance of eye contact is a gesture of respect and speak clearly. Understanding extended periods of silence is considered normal, and ask the patient how they would like to be addressed. Auntie and uncle are often used. So how physiotherapists can show respect. Ensure that no staff member makes any racial comments. Ask the patient if they would prefer a male or female physiotherapist. Many Indigenous Australians may prefer treatment from a physiotherapist of the same gender. And ask if they would prefer to be accompanied by a family member or a family friend when being treated. The need for change institutional racism in healthcare is to first recognise and then address racism, provide greater funding and resources to remote communities, employ Indigenous Australian staff to remove cultural barriers, and remove the differences in treatment regimes. Indigenous Australians are often receive lower cost nursing care compared to their white cohort of the similar age. Healthcare guided by the patient perspectives. Guided by Indigenous Australian perspectives to ensure healthcare for Indigenous Australians is optimised to provide a better experience for the patient along with reducing healthcare costs in the process. Help non-Indigenous Australians work in healthcare to have a greater appreciation and knowledge of the importance of proper communication and understanding when it comes to healthcare requirements for Indigenous Australians. Moving forward, it's important to have potentially, where it's logistically possible, have designated hospital clinics and wards specifically for Indigenous Australian, have trained Indigenous Australians working in healthcare, and having a healthcare setting for Indigenous Australians is less confronting and more inviting. Now, I've just provided a YouTube clip which you can watch in your own time, which clearly demonstrates the advantages of having Indigenous Australian centre healthcare, with many of the staff being Indigenous Australians themselves. So thank you very much for your time. I hope this helps. If there's any questions about what's contained within the presentation, please feel welcome to correspond with me. But this is something that I feel is important and needs to be addressed, and thank you for your time. Just provide you with a list of resources which you may also like to have a look at in greater detail in the future. Thank you very much.